The myths surrounding the Alexandrian library being burned by maybe Christians. You guys don't want to miss this episode. Consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. I release hundreds of videos on there, all early access. Everything I put on YouTube, you'll get early access to on Patreon. And also you help me continue my endeavors in educating the general public. If you want to do a one-time donation, you can do it on my PayPal or my Cash App. It's all down in the description. Love you guys. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Have you guys ever heard about the myth of the burning of the Alexandrian library or myths surrounding the Alexandrian library? This is a show you want to check out. We have author and blog, if you will, blog author, Tim O'Neill. I am an atheist, he says. So this is his excerpt. And you got to go to the site, historyforatheists.com. I am an atheist, for those who think he's a theist, a skeptic, and rationalist, who is a subscribing member of the Atheist Foundation of Australia and a former state president of the Australian Skeptics. I have contributed to many atheism and skepticism, I think you forum or whatever, for over the years, and have a posting record as a rationalist that goes back to at least 1992. I have a bachelor's degree with honors in English and history and a research master's degree from the University of Tasmania with a specialization in historicist analysis of medieval literature. Welcome to the channel.
Hey, thanks, Derek. Good to be back.
Yeah.
As we've discussed before, we have to do that disclaimer because some people don't like some of the stuff I say. Because what I'm doing is debunking. I mean, a lot of people know that I debunk Christian bad history, but my blog, History for Atheists, is really focused on debunking atheist bad history because I think we should get history right. Christians, obviously, that's what they do is their problem. But as an atheist, I think we should make sure that we avoid spreading misinformation, even if it's misinformation that we might be inclined to want to believe. We need to guard against that. So that's really what we're all about. But yeah, so thanks for asking me back on. Hopefully this one won't be quite as controversial as my last couple.
Dude, everything you do is controversial.
Yeah, that's true.
You literally just said you attack, obviously, if you will, or not attack, maybe that's a bad word. You like to diffuse bad information on the Christian side. You like to diffuse bad information on the atheist side. You're just asking for it, aren't you, from everybody?
The funny thing is, I was looking the other day, and I won't mention his name, but there's quite a prominent sort of YouTuber. He's an atheist YouTuber, and he's got something like 500,000 followers.
Oh, wow.
And I've got like 2,500 followers on Twitter. And I was thinking about that. And I was also looking at some of these really good historians who are quite active on Twitter, and they've got maybe 2,000, 3,000 followers. And I was thinking, how's this kid got 500,000 followers? And the answer is because he's telling people stuff they want to hear. And anyone, lots of people like to be told stuff they want to hear. I tell people stuff they don't want to hear.
Yeah.
But that's me. I don't mind. I don't care. So long as some people are paying attention. But today you mentioned sort of the Alexandrian library. So what I want to talk about is a pretty common story that I think many people would have heard, and that's the story of how Christians destroyed the Great Library of Alexandria. Mm-hmm. Now, you get various versions of it, and some versions have different elements to others, but most of them are about how there was this great repository of ancient learning and reason and science and rationality called the Great Library of Alexandria. It was the biggest library in the ancient world, and it contained the sum total of ancient learning. But Christians came along and burned it down and destroyed that learning and plunged us into a dark age. And if it wasn't for that, we would have all this advanced knowledge. We'd be 1,000 years ahead of where we are now. And Christians held us back. And so we have to make sure that Christians don't do that again.
Didn't Carl Sagan fall for this exact thing?
He did. In fact, a lot of the online versions of this story can be traced back to Carl Sagan's 1980 television series, TV documentary series Cosmos. And it's interesting how popular culture tends to shape a lot of historical myths. And so Sagan was he was an astronomer. He was a very, very good astronomer. He was a great public educator when it came to science. And I remember watching Cosmos as a teenager and thinking it was fantastic, and watched it many times and read the book and loved it. It was only later I found that he wasn't very good at history. He's good at science,
right,
but he was pretty bad at history. And this is because scientists tend to study history in high school and then don't study it beyond that. And so they're kind of stunted at about a kind of a high school level. And Sagan would have gone to high school back in the 1950s. And so a lot of stuff that he thought was correct is sort of based on the fact that he never actually studied history in any detail beyond that. So while Sagan's documentary is great, still great stuff, and was a really good series, on the science, on history, I say treat him with care. Towards the end of the documentary and towards the end of the book, he made a plea for the preservation of science education and a plea for the preservation of knowledge. He was writing the series in 1979, and he was rightly very fearful of two things. One was the rise of fundamentalist Christianity in America, and the other was the Cold War and the danger of nuclear annihilation. And so he was making this plea for the future, and that was what the final chapter of his book and the final program in his series was about. He used a story, I won't say the story, a story of the Great Library of Alexandria to illustrate that point. And so he said, this is what we need to preserve because we had it once. It was destroyed by the forces of ignorance and mysticism, and we suffered the consequences, and we can't allow that to happen again.
There's a great myth.
It's a great moral, but what he's done is he's taken a kind of a pseudo-historical story and used it as a moral fable. Mm-hmm. And the problem is the history that he gave in that was largely wrong. I might come back to some of the stuff that Sagan got wrong. But what happens then as a result is that becomes the story that most people know. And so as a result, whenever anytime I see any reference to the Great Library of Alexandria online, if you look at the comments section on an online article that mentions the Great Library, you can guarantee there will be someone saying, those fucking Christians destroyed the Great Library. It's every time, absolutely every time. So what I'd like to do today in this show is sort of tell the real story of what the Great Library was, talk about what the Great Library wasn't, because a lot of the Sagan version, if we call it that, actually it makes claims that aren't correct about the Great Library, and then talk about what actually happened to the Great Library, and then we'll get to the bit about Christians burning it down towards the end. I don't want to guess. Damn Christians! I don't want to give away the ending. We'll get there. Okay, we'll get there.
I want to ask everybody who's watching this, by the way, Tim, if you have an idea or you have an assumption about this, I ask to put it on the shelf for right now. I always ask this on MythVision, please, because you can learn from everyone. I was just telling this to Tim before. Even if someone, and I'm not saying you, I'm saying in general, if someone has misinformation, if you continue to research, you'll know the ins and outs of various viewpoints and different ideas. Test what he's saying out. If you're a skeptic and you let me make sure, go and check it out. In fact, that's what Tim's all about, saying go and check it for yourself. You'll see what he's saying. So I just want to encourage everybody to open up their mind and be interested in this information to learn, not just to, how can I try and poke holes at some of my guests? No, this is real important stuff, you guys. And I really do appreciate you, dude. I'm serious.
Cool. Okay. So maybe we should start right at the beginning about what the Great Library of Alexandria was. So Alexandria was an ancient city in the north of Egypt. It was established by Alexander the Great, who thought he was pretty great, and so established lots of cities across his empire named after himself. So this was one of a number of cities called Alexandria, which were established across the empire all the way over to India. This was the first one, and he established it on the Mediterranean coast on the north of Egypt. He died fairly young, and his empire then got broken up and shared amongst his generals, who then, they and their successors then promptly spent the next sort of 150 to 200 years going to war with each other. The general who got this bit, who got Egypt, was pretty lucky because he got probably one of the richest parts of Alexander's former empire. Egypt was immensely wealthy because it was very, very much the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world, and Alexandria became a great city because it was a port city, and it was a link between the Mediterranean world and via the Red Sea the rest of the world. So through to the Indian Ocean. So it was a trading hub, and it became immensely wealthy. The Ptolemaic Kings, his name was Ptolemy, and he's referred to as the first king of the Ptolemaic kingdom. So he was called Ptolemy I, called Soter. So Ptolemy I Soter established a dynasty that extended for many hundreds of years. He may have been the guy who founded the Great Library of Alexandria, or it may have been his son. So it could have been his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. We don't really know. I won't go into the details, but there's conflicting stories. Whoever it was, though, what happened was he built a royal palace in the upper city, so the part down near the harbour, and this was a palace complex, extremely elaborate, extremely rich, and part of it was a shrine to the Nine Muses called the Mouseion, or museum, which is where we get the modern word museum. This was a temple to the 9 goddesses, who were the goddesses of the arts and sciences, the goddesses of learning. And museions around the ancient world tended to be centers of learning as a result. So they tended to be not just temples, though it was a temple, but also centers of scholarship, and they tended to sponsor scholars. And so, of course, where you have scholars, you have books. So when we talk about the Great Library of Alexandria, what we're actually talking about is the book collection associated with the Royal Mouseion in Alexandria. This was in the royal quarter, it was part of the royal palace, and it was very much a private institution owned and sponsored by the kings of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt.
May I just kind of poke something I think is interesting about what you just presented? What I like about you, Tim, is that you'll give credit wherever credit is due, regardless. You are an atheist, rationalist, skeptic. You're like me, man. We're not drinking the Kool-Aid. At the same time, I want to ask this question. It sounds like this temple, which is this museum, of course, for learning, sounds like out of religious movements and out of religious thought comes education initially. It seems like education may come out of these schools of thought, so to speak, encouraging people to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come back to that because I think that's a really good point. Yes, they believe that you could get an understanding of the world through both rational analysis and also through revelation. And so the idea that religion is something that's anti-intellectual and intellectual pursuits have to be anti-religious is a very modern idea. The ancients didn't see it that way. So Carl Sagan, in the part of his TV series where he's talking about the Great Library, he talks about how he's standing in a ruin of one of the adjuncts. There was a daughter library, which I'll talk about towards the end, of the Great Library called the Serapeum. And he said it was originally a temple, but it was later reconsecrated to knowledge. Well, that's nonsense. It was never reconsecrated to anything. It was always a temple. Temples often had libraries in them. And this particular temple, the Mouseion, was a temple that was associated with, in fact, fundamental to it, it was knowledge, learning and study, and therefore books. So what happened was, because it was a very large and well-established and well-funded museum, because the kings of Ptolemaic Egypt were immensely rich, it attracted some excellent scholars. because if you were a scholar, you really needed, in the ancient world, you needed a patron, and this guy was one of the richest in the world. So some of the best scholars in the world came to Alexandria, and that meant that they attracted students, and they attracted books. They brought books with them. But the other thing that happened was that the kings of Ptolemaic Egypt really wanted to build up the book collection associated with their museum to make it even better, and so they actively sought out bringing books into this institution. One story, and it's probably not true, people often repeat it, but it's a good story, was that any ship coming into Alexandria was searched, and any book found on that ship was taken to the library of the Mouseion, and if they didn't have a copy of that book, they made a copy, and they held the ship there until the copy had been made. Then they gave the ship back the copy. They kept the original.
Great story.
It's a terrific story. Now, it's probably not true, because the idea that these guys were merchants, the idea that they would be holding up a ship for as long as it takes to copy a whole book, which was a long time, it could be weeks, months, or even years, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But what it tells us is how much they value books, and how much they were building up this huge library. So I think probably the first thing to keep in mind is what the Great Library was. It was very much the book collection of the Mouseion. When you see pictures of the Great Library, or you get reproductions of them in Carl Sagan's documentary, but also you see them in video games. So the Assassin's Creed recently had a video game set in the ancient Greek and Roman world, and they had this great reproduction. It looks beautiful. Yeah. Of the Great Library. Unfortunately, it didn't look like that. So I know I'm always doing this. So the idea of a great sort of echoing hall with these huge stacks of shelves with scrolls piled up in them, and learned-looking bearded men in robes sitting around tables opening up scrolls and studying. That's not what it looked like. That kind of library, which is very much a style that's familiar to us, was actually something developed later by the Romans. The Romans sort of came up with that style of library. But because the Mouseion was very much fundamentally a research institution associated with this temple, the layout, from what we can gather from the one account that we do have by Strabo, seems to be that it was a complex of buildings. It included lecture halls, because it held lectures. It included dormitories and sleeping accommodation, a kind of a dining hall and kitchens, and sleeping accommodation for its small army of slaves. There were hundreds of slaves who were part of the staff of the institution. But the library bit seems to have been arranged around colonnades. So they had kind of courtyards with covered walkways around them, gardens in the middle, and that's where the scholars sat, at desks around these colonnades, and the books were held in rooms off from those colonnades. And so a scholar would sit and do their work at a desk, sun coming in from the courtyard, because that meant they had natural light, and in a world before electricity, natural light was pretty important. But also they were in the shade, and so it was nice and cool. And in Egypt, that's pretty important. So this arrangement actually made a lot of sense. Whereas if you had them inside in a great big hall, in a period where windows were either very, very small or had no glass in them, it would be really dark. And you would have to have artificial light, and papyrus scrolls don't mix.
Yeah.
This is why libraries did burn down, because scrolls are pretty flammable. So this arrangement actually made a lot of sense. Initially, all of the library was held in these rooms around the colonnades. Later on, as the library got bigger, it got held, more and more of it got held in other parts of the royal quarter. So we know that at least some of them, by the 1st century BC, were being held in warehouses down on the docks. That was because that was where they had the storage space. And we know that there were overflow libraries, so daughter libraries, about 3 or 4 of those around the city. One of those was in the temple of Julius Caesar, the Caesarium, and another later on was held in the temple of Serapis, or the Serapeum, or Siparium. We'll get back to the Serapeum. That's an important part of the story. So in the heyday of the Great Library, this was the arrangement. You had these scholars coming from all over the world. You had the royal the royal quarter as the center of learning, and you had the kings, the Ptolemaic kings, sponsoring the whole thing, and of course buying and copying books. They had a whole staff of slaves, and 3/4 of what they would have been doing would have been copying books, because the scrolls wore out. Papyrus is quite fragile stuff, so they were constantly having to restock what was going on, as well as bringing in new copies.
I just have to say that becomes a problem for some of the people I talk to who are super skeptics on the history of things. I think I sent it to you about new chronology, and I don't want to go sideways with that, but just the point is, one of the things I've heard is, and I get like being skeptical about certain things, but like when things have to be copied and copied and copied, are you now like saying, I just don't trust that comes from that period because I don't have the original scroll from 3 centuries BC. You see what I'm saying? So
yeah.
It's
and it's easy to be hyper skeptical about that stuff. I mean, I've had some people saying to me, well, there's no copies of the Gospels prior to the 4th century, therefore how do we know that they actually date to the 1st century? And the answer is we've got no complete copies prior to the 4th century, but we have fragmentary copies that date right into the 2nd century, and therefore there must have been, those copies are kind of like a tip of an iceberg, so there must have been earlier copies, and there's all sorts of internal reasons why we conclude that they were written in the second half of the 1st century.
I just thought I'd make that note, because if it's copying, you know how it goes.
Look, exactly right. But but it's an important thing to understand as to how books were produced in the ancient world. So speaking of books, so that's what the Great Library was. As far as what it wasn't, one of the things it wasn't was a library that you could just wander into off the street. So I've seen some people say anyone could study there. Well, that's total crap. If you tried to walk into the Mouseion off the street, they had a whole squadron of royal guards that would be very quickly throwing you back into the street. This was in the royal quarter. It was part of the royal palace, so you couldn't just wander in and start browsing the shelves. The only people who used the books in the Great Library were the scholars who were invited by and sponsored by the king. So it was actually a very small group of people who used the ones in the Mouseion. The ones in the daughter libraries were a bit more open, because they were open to the public. So the Caesarean Library and the Serapeum Library were both open to the public, as libraries in temple compounds usually were. But the Mouseion was a bit different. That was a private affair. The number of books is something else that people talk about. So there's two numbers that you often hear, right? So because we're told the library was huge. Now, if you're thinking about this story as a moral fable, the bigger the library is, the more tragic its destruction is. So the moral fable version talks about it being this immense collection of books, 500,000 books, 700,000 books. These are the numbers that are thrown around. Anyone who has studied, any historian of the ancient world will tell you that any numbers on anything that you find in ancient sources have to be taken with an enormous grain of salt, because numbers were usually used in ancient sources as kind of rhetorical effect. So if I want to say that Attila the Hun invaded with a really big army, I say he had 500,000 warriors. That doesn't mean he actually had 500,000 warriors. It's just a way of saying it was a big army. So we have to be fairly skeptical about any numbers. The other reason we have to be skeptical about the numbers that are given for the Great Library's collection is that we've got about 6 or 7 different sources that give us figures for the size of the library, and the figures that they give are all completely different. And they range very widely in terms of the size. So there's one that gives a rather precise figure of 54,800 books, which is suspiciously precise. There's another that says 40,000. There's one that says 400,000. There's one that says 490,000. Then we've got 500,000. Then we've got 700,000. And the other thing is, it's not as though the smaller numbers are from early sources and the larger numbers are later ones. So we're talking about the growth of the library. They're all over the place. We get big numbers from early sources, small numbers from later ones. I think what we can say is that we don't know, and that no one knew. I don't think anyone in the museum itself would have had a clear idea of how large the collection was.
Hey, Bob, go count those scrolls again. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And particularly since it wasn't held in one place. You've got the library sort of distributed over various storage facilities. So no one really knew. It's very difficult for us to get an estimate, but what we can do is we can look at other libraries in the ancient world where we can get an idea of the size. So there was the Library of Trajan in the Forum of Trajan in the middle of Rome, and because we can actually excavate that building, we've got an idea of how big it is. Therefore, we've got an idea of how many books it probably would have held, and we can estimate that it would have held around about 20,000 scrolls. Now, that's 20,000 scrolls. That doesn't mean 20,000 books, to 20,000 works. So a scroll could contain several small, short works, or a long work could be split up over about 30 or 40 scrolls. So we know one of Livy's histories was written over in 30 books. So that's 30 scrolls. So a scroll doesn't mean a book, and a book doesn't mean a scroll. So the Library of Trajan seems to have been about 20, we estimate about 20,000 scrolls. There was also the Great Library of Pergamon in what's now Turkey. And again, we can actually excavate the footprint of what we think, it's not certain, but we think was the actual building in which that was held. And again, we can make an estimate. There, the estimate seems to be about 30,000 scrolls. The interesting thing here is that the Great Library of Alexandria and the Great Library of Pergamon were rivals. The scholars at Pergamon and the scholars at Alexandria hated each other, and there was enormous rivalry between the two. So again, there's a great story. It's probably not true, but it tells us something, that in order to strangle the book collection at the Great Library of Pergamon, the kings of Ptolemaic Egypt banned the export of papyrus from Egypt to Pergamon, because papyrus is a reed that grows in the Nile Delta, and they thought this will fix them. They won't be able to copy any more books, and so the scholars in Pergamon responded by inventing parchment, which is made from animal skins, and so they were able to copy their books after all. Again, nice little story, probably not true. But what it tells us is that there was a genuine rivalry between these two institutions.
Right.
So if the Great Library of Pergamon is around about 30,000 scrolls, and if that seems to be the size of a really big library, sort of 20 to 30 to 40,000 scrolls in the ancient world, then it kind of makes sense that it's more likely that the collection of the Mouseion, so the Great Library of Alexandria, probably wouldn't have been much above about 40, maybe 50,000 scrolls. Now, that's still pretty big.
Yeah.
But it's 1/10 of the size of some of the estimates. There's a really interesting sort of article by a historian called Bagnall who looks at the output of the number of scholars that we know about in the ancient world, and what their likely output would have been in terms of the number of books they wrote, and therefore factoring in the fact that we might not know, we probably don't know about all of them, even if they were only a fraction, how many books would there have been at any given time? And you still don't get much above maybe 60 or 70,000 works. So the idea that it held 500,000 or 700,000 books, that's fantasy. Right, so anyone who says the Great Library of Alexandria was as big as that, that's almost certainly not true.
I also like how you said, just for anyone who's going to peep the conclusion of this episode, you point out, like, we're talking about, one library. It's not like there was this conspiracy to go burn every library in history. You know what I'm saying? So
exactly. So this is another part of the moral fable, which really actually you just hit the nail on the head. It doesn't make any sense. The idea that Christians came along and burned down this one library, and so that destroyed all the knowledge of the ancient world, just makes no sense at all. Of course, we know that there were many other libraries. There were thousands of them. There were other big libraries. I just mentioned a couple of them: Library of Trajan, the Library of Pergamon. There was the Great Library of Celsus in the city of Ephesus. And there were, we know in Rome itself, there were hundreds of libraries. There were libraries established by the Emperor Augustus. Most forums, so the centers of Roman power, had a library. I've already mentioned that there were libraries in many temples. These libraries varied in the type of book they would have held. So we know, for example, that a rich citizen might have a library in his house, probably a few hundred books, and that would tend to be on topics that he was interested in. So a rich citizen who was interested in history would have a lot more books on history than, say, books on technical subjects. These great libraries, though, tended to have books on a whole range of subjects. But the idea that Christians could come along, burn down one library and destroy the knowledge of the entire ancient world is just patently stupid. That doesn't make any sense. I've had people say to me, that was just a representation. They burned down a whole lot of libraries, to which I say, okay, one, evidence, please. Two, actually, we know that Christianity, while it did have an early debate about whether or not there was any worth to ancient Greek philosophy and learning. And so there certainly were some hardline Christians who said, we've got the books of Holy Scripture, that's all we need. They lost the debate. So guys like Clement of Alexandria, who was working in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD, argued that all knowledge came from God, and therefore it should all be accepted as a gift from God, just as the books of the Old Testament, so the Jewish scriptures, were a gift from God via the Jews to Christianity. So the knowledge of the natural world and philosophy it was a gift of God through the Greeks to Christianity. So
I actually appreciate that too, though. You know what I mean? Yeah. Even though I don't believe that, I'm glad guys like him do exist that try to keep the knowledge around to some degree, you know?
We probably wouldn't have what we've got from the ancient world if they didn't. Because if they had lost that argument, then there's a very good chance that a lot of this stuff would have been completely lost. Now, obviously, we have lost a hell of a lot of it. Yeah. But people who say, well, that's because Christianity destroyed it. Well, actually, no. And I've actually got an article on my blog where I take a list of the contents of a particular guy's library, a Christian bishop's library, and I compare which of the books that he had in his library that are Christian books survive compared to the ones that he had in his library that are pagan books or books by pagan authors. And I found that the survival rate of both is exactly the same. In fact, if anything, the pagan survival rate is slightly higher. Now, that doesn't mean that's one sample, but it's a pretty big sample. It's a sample of several hundred books. So it looks like what actually happened was that if we did lose any sort of pre-Christian works, it's because the odds were stacked against the survival of any book in the ancient world, because they existed in so few copies. I don't know if you've ever sat and copied something out by hand. It's really tedious.
Right? Nothing like a book, though. Nothing like a book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do a bit of calligraphy, and so I actually, years ago, sat down and did a hand copy of a medieval text in a medieval hand using medieval techniques, and it's really hard work. So you can sort of see why there were so few books, and therefore, if you've got so few books, the survival rate for any book is extremely small. So that's I suppose one thing that a lot of people get wrong about the Great Library, and that's that it had 500,000 books. It didn't. It probably had about 50,000. Still, that's quite a few. I think another thing that a lot of people do get a little bit wrong is that it was very much a centre of science, and this is part of what Sagan's version of the story emphasizes. He talks about Eratosthenes working there, which is true. He talks about Archimedes working there, which isn't true. He rattles off a whole list of scientists who he says were scholars at the Great Library or scholars at the Mouseion, and most of them, apart from maybe 3, probably weren't. But he puts a lot of emphasis on that because that's the tragedy of the loss of the Great Library. We lost all this science. So what were they doing? What were they studying at the Great Library? If the first thing we need to keep in mind is that, unlike a modern university, any ancient centre of learning was generally not divided up into specialties and specializations and kind of faculties. So you didn't have some people sitting over there who were doing physics, and some people over here who were studying politics, and some people over here who were doing geometry and mathematics. All ancient scholars tended to be polymaths. So they tended to study everything. And there's a reason for that. And that's because they were studying this stuff for a very different reason to modern scholars. Modern scholars are really studying stuff for its own sake because they have an interest and because it might have a practical application in the outside world. But in the ancient world, what philosophers were doing was they were trying to answer what was fundamentally an ethical question, which was, what's the best way for me to live? So this is what all ancient Greek philosophy was all about. What's the best way to live? How do I live a good life? Now, living a good life for an ancient Greek philosopher was living a life that's fulfilling to me, but also is good for me. So I might live a life where I'm having a great time, but is that good for me? If I'm getting drunk all the time and eating lots of food, I might be having a good time in the short term, and in the long term, that's probably not a good life. And this is why a lot of ancient Greek philosophers, like the Epicureans, for example, and some others, the Cynics and so on, were actually quite frugal and ascetic in the way in which they lived, because they said this is a better life. It's better to live simply rather than sort of living to excess. But the other thing they were looking at was, how do I live as part of the wider world? So they studied politics, they studied how we relate to each other, they studied ethics, and they also studied the natural world, because one of the questions was, how do I live in the world? Well, first I have to understand what the world is. So I have to get a fundamental understanding of the world. So this is why they studied what they called natural philosophy. We use the shorthand word science to describe that. So you often hear about ancient Greek science. The ancient Greeks were doing science. And a lot of people, Carl Sagan is one, your dear friend Richard Carrier is another, really emphasizes the similarities between ancient Greek science, what I call proto-scientific natural philosophy, but I use science for short, and modern science. The problem with that is that the ancient Greeks were not doing this scientific-ish stuff for the same reason that modern scientists were. They were answering different questions, largely philosophical questions about how do I live a good life. And that secondly, they weren't using the same techniques. So they weren't using the modern scientific method. They had bits of the modern scientific method. They did do some experiments. They did use measurement sometimes. They did check information. They did use observation. They did form hypotheses and all of that stuff. But they didn't bring it all together in the modern scientific method that didn't really coalesce until the 16th century AD. So they weren't doing science in the modern sense of the word. We have to be very careful about that.
This is interesting because I'm actually reading a book right now, Tim Whitmarsh, Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World. Man, he is a load of information as well. Yeah. He knows quite a bit. And I love what you're saying here, because it comes down to that natural science of philosophy. What's the point of living like? And I love what he does to point out atheists in the ancient world. It's more difficult to do that because most people wrote from some worldview that the gods were real. But he shows like some of these people that actually are trying to explain how to live, but not needing to invoke the deities. And touching on that kind of, I mean, you're not touching on the atheistic side, but you're pointing out the philosophers were doing this for a while. And
that's a great book, and I've discussed it with Tim, and he actually has an endorsement of my blog that I've put on my blog. He's a great guy. We disagree on a couple of things. I think he kind of overemphasizes the atheism of some of those philosophers. Many of them, we don't need the gods, but they still believed in them. Okay. Or they believed in a divine principle, even if they didn't believe that there was a guy sitting on Mount Olympus, chucking thunderbolts. So they were atheists in one sense or another. But he look, Tim Whitmarsh is a very learned and excellent historian, and I'm glad you're enjoying his book. I recommend it very highly.
Thank you.
But he understands. He obviously does get across extremely well in that book that ancient philosophy was quite different to what we think of as philosophy, and it was an ancient natural philosophy was not modern science. So he definitely makes that quite clear. One of the issues that's involved in that is what it means is that the ancient Greek philosophers, ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, were often approaching questions of the natural world with a lot of philosophical assumptions that were wrong. And that's because they weren't doing science in the modern sense where you were trying to approach it as objectively as possible. They were approaching it through a philosophical and moral and ethical framework. So they assumed a lot of stuff that was actually fundamentally wrong. So as a result, there was a fundamental idea in ancient Greek and Roman geometry and therefore astronomy that the circle was the perfect figure and perfect form. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, to us, it doesn't make any sense at all. But they thought in moral terms about the universe. So a circle was a good shape, and something that wasn't quite a circle wasn't a good shape. So as a result, they had to come up with a system of astronomy where everything moved in circles. The only problem is they don't. The planets and so on move in ellipses. They didn't like ellipses. Ellipses were not morally good, if we can put it that way. They were not perfect forms. So you got the whole Ptolemaic system, which is this bizarre mathematical kludge of circles within circles, epicycles and epicenters and various other bits and pieces to try and explain what's going on in the sky in terms of circles, despite the fact that that's not what's going on in the sky. So this is what I mean about them often approaching things with presuppositions that were completely wrong.
Right.
Another example is, we often hear about, the ancient Greeks believed that the Earth was round, and that's true, and demonstrated through reason that it was, and that's true, and measured the size of the Earth, and that's true. But what we don't hear is that there were other Greek philosophers at the same time who thought the Earth was flat. So you never actually hear about that. But the Epicureans, quite a large philosophical school, well into the Roman period, were still thinking in terms of a flat Earth universe. You never hear about that. So we hear a lot about the stuff that these ancient Greek and Roman natural philosophers got right. We tend not to hear about the stuff that they got wrong. And that gives us, again, another warped view of how rational and scientific they actually were. And it gives us an impression that they were doing modern style science when they actually weren't. And again, I mentioned Eratosthenes. I mentioned him a couple of times. He did study at the Mouseion. And he's the guy who famously used geometry to measure the size of the Earth. And we often hear about how he got it almost right. His measurement was very accurate. What we don't hear about are the other Greek scientists who disagree with him. So we don't hear as much about Ptolemy and his measurement of the Earth, which was actually a lot more influential than Eratosthenes' one. But he got it wildly wrong. But we never hear about that. We only hear about the guy who got it right. So we've got this very sort of rosy view of ancient Greek and Roman science. Now, this is not me denigrating ancient Greek and Roman philosophers.
No, you're just pointing out
very
the fact.
smart. They were very smart guys. But we have to be careful of that word science when we're talking about this. We have to remember it's a shorthand for induction-based proto-scientific natural philosophy, which was largely a metaphysical analysis of the physical world, which is a bit long and complicated. So we just say science, but it doesn't mean they were doing science. So the idea that the Great Library, or the Mouseion, was a whole lot of guys sitting around doing science, and they would have been, inventing flying machines and maybe coming up with nuclear physics until Christians came along and burned the place down. That's fantasy. Nothing like that was going on. So what was going on in the Mouseion? Well, remember what I was saying before about these guys being polymaths. So they studied a whole lot of stuff. So no one was studying just one thing. That's important to remember. But when we look at the output of the people that we do know were scholars there, when we look at the books they wrote and the books that they were famous for, what we find is that one of the major things they were studying in the Mouseion was poetry, not science. Now, for a modern person, that sounds really weird. Why were these great scholars who on one hand were doing things like measuring the size of the Earth and estimating the distance to the sun and all this stuff, why the hell would they be studying poetry? Well, first of all, it was a temple to the Nine Muses, and 6 of the Nine Muses are actually muses of various forms of poetry, song and dance. Only one of them, Urantia, is the goddess of what we would consider to be a scientific discipline, astronomy. which was actually then was considered a bit more kind of mystical than our astronomy. So why were they studying poetry? This gets back to what you were talking about before. You were saying that sometimes stuff that we consider to be scientific and useful can actually come out of religion. They believed that you could understand the world through reason, quite famously, and they did so. They examined the world rationally. But they also believed in revelation. Mm-hmm. And so they believed that certain poetry, particularly poetry that had stood the test of time, was literally an insight into the world given to us by the divine. And so the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also the poems of Hesiod, the odes of Pindar, and various other poems which were considered to be sort of wholly ancient and therefore pretty much sacred. They were regarded as more than just poems. These were insights into the world. This was a mirror into the world. And so a single line or a couple of lines of Homer could have a whole book written about it, about what it means.
That's what Tim was going through in his book. He's like, they're trying to like allegorize everything.
Everything, yeah.
And it didn't mean any of that in its initials. So they're doing the same thing Christians love to do with.
Exactly. Yeah. Where do you think Christians got it from? People think that Christians, arrived in the ancient world from an alien planet or something. They didn't. They were products of this. And so they were just doing what people had been doing for centuries. They were doing with their ancient texts what Jews have been doing with their ancient texts, but also what the Greeks have been doing with Homer and these other great works of literature. So there's the two lines in Homer, I'm pretty sure it's in the Odyssey, where Homer, in passing, talks about the Ethiopians, so the people of northern Africa, and how they were divided in two by a sundering ocean. Throwaway line, it's just mentioned in passing. Whole books were written about what that means for geography, right? So they said, well, if there are Ethiopians, we know there are Ethiopians here in what they call the Okumene, the known world. We know that there are Ethiopians in North Africa. If there are other Ethiopians who are divided from those ones that we know about by the sundering ocean, then that must mean they live on the other side of the world. So that means the world must have other continents on the other side of the equator, and therefore, the whole books were written about how many of these continents there were, and these were referred to as the Antipodes, but they were given various other names as well. Whole books were written all because Homer put this one line in. This was what was going on. So when I say they were studying poetry, part of what they were doing was studying this. They were also studying the structure of poetry and the stuff that universities do with poetry to this day. But they're also developing a whole lot of apparatus for the study of poetry and other texts. So when they started gathering together various copies and manuscripts of the works of Homer, one of the things they found when they compared them was that there were differences. And some of those differences might be a word here or there. Others might be half a line or a few sentences. In some places, though, there was whole pages of text that were in some manuscripts but not in others. So then the question became, well, if these are kind of like pretty much sacred texts, what was the original? We've got to get back to the original. So they started doing what Christians then did with the books of the Bible, of trying to work out what the true word actually was. And Christians are doing this to this day.
Everyone was doing this. The Jews were doing this with their sacred.
Jews were doing it too. Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
So again, Christians were just part of this ancient intellectual world. They weren't doing something new. They were part of a continuum. So that was another thing that they came up with, was textual analysis. And scholars to this day still do that with, say, the works of Shakespeare, or the works of, say, Chaucer, or any other early pre-modern or early modern writer, where the original text might be a little bit uncertain, and we're trying to come up with a definitive edition. So this stuff is still done to this day. Another thing that they came up with at the Great Library of Alexandria was how to classify words. Now, if you and I come across a word that we don't know, we can go to a dictionary and look it up. Those guys had to invent the concept of a dictionary, and they did it because they were coming across old words in some of these ancient poems, and were having to go and research what they meant. and then they were cataloguing these words. They came up with the apparatus of a dictionary. So when we pick up a dictionary today or get online and look at one, you have the word, you have some grammatical information about whether it's a noun, verb, adverb, or whatever. You then have a definition, and then you have some quotes which put the word in context and show you how it works in context. That was all invented at the Mouseion. So the scholars of the Mouseion came up with that. They also came up with a way of classifying, ordering those dictionaries or those lexicons using alphabetical order. Now, if you and I was using an Excel spreadsheet work the other day, and I had to order some stuff, so the first thing I did was I put it into alphabetical order. We just think naturally along those lines. They invented alphabetical order. So there was a lot of stuff going on at the Great Library, which was not science. A hell of a lot of it was the study of poetry, which probably about as far away from science as you could possibly get. And the idea that it was like some kind of ancient MIT or Google campus where everyone was sitting around, just doing tinkering with machines. It wasn't like that. And just thinking about, for example, I remember studying chemistry or studying the beginnings of atomic theory at school. And the very first thing my science teacher said to us was the Greeks invented the concept of the atom. And so for years I thought, the Greeks came up with the concept of the atom and the whole of atomic theory goes back to the Greeks. It doesn't. What the Greeks have given us is the word atom, but the actual beginnings of atomic theory actually began in the 18th century with the study of chemistry, when they did have a scientific method and they were looking at some chemical reactions and thinking, how does this work? And eventually they thought there must be fundamental particles that are happening in this way. They gave it an ancient Greek name. What were the Greeks doing? Well, the Greeks were doing metaphysical philosophy. So they were sitting around in maybe in one of those colonnades gardens, sipping a cup of wine and talking. And someone would say, well, if I take a block of marble and I cut it in half, I've got 2 pieces of marble. I cut those in half, I've got 4. Cut those in half, I've got 8. How long can I keep cutting? So it was a philosophical question about could you cut forever? Or do you get to a point where you get to something that is uncuttable, which is what the word atom, atomos, uncuttable, means. But the important thing is that no one walked away from that conversation in the ancient world and thought, I'm going to go and do an experiment on some stuff to work out how atoms work. No one did that.
Isn't this based on Plato's philosophy as well? I mean, I'm sure he didn't get it. Plato didn't invent this idea. I mean, but the idea of spheres, it plays into the spheres, smaller, lesser, and larger spheres and stuff.
They were very good at coming up with positing possible ways in which the universe could be structured. Right. But because they didn't have the scientific method, they weren't anywhere near as good as we are, obviously, at then being able to test that. They just didn't have the equipment, the intellectual equipment to be able to do it. Doesn't mean they weren't smart. They just didn't have the stuff that the tools that we have, such as the scientific method. So they quite often thought about stuff such as, well, if I drop 2 weights and one weight is heavier than the other, then the heavier weight will fall faster than the other. That intuitively makes sense, but if you actually do the experiment and do it properly, actually they fall at the same rate. So they often thought things through inductively, but they quite often came to the wrong conclusions. So what we need to remember is when they're doing things like sitting around talking about atoms, they're not doing atomic theory. They're really doing metaphysics. And so there was very little, not none, but very little connection between the natural philosophy that they were doing and making stuff. Now, I've got friends who are scientists who are work in theoretical areas of science, physics, and so on. And when they describe at dinner parties or cocktail parties what they do, and quite often someone will say, "Yeah, but what does that do? What do you do with that?" And they go, nothing. We just study it because it's interesting to study. In the modern world, we have this very 19th century connection between science and technology, but in the ancient world, that was nowhere near as strong. They occasionally did take the concepts that they came up with, so geometry and so on, kinetics, to solve real world problems. Like how do we make better catapults to knock down walls? They did sometimes actually apply this stuff, but there wasn't the same level of connection between science and technology. In fact, most of these guys, particularly the ones who would have been working at the Mouseion, who were once satirically described as birds in a gilded cage, removed from the real world, a bit like the ivory tower. If you said to them, well, how about you take this stuff that you're thinking about and use it to make things, they would be insulted. These guys were aristocratic, lofty-minded thinkers. Slaves made shit. Mechanics, the lower classes made stuff. So the idea that they would be applying it to technology just is something that generally didn't actually occur to them. There were a couple of exceptions to that. One actually is from Alexandria, a guy called Heron of Alexandria. Yeah. But he really just kind of tinkered with stuff. He didn't really make anything that or come up with any technology that was really useful in the real world. He was interested in physically applying some of the stuff he was coming up with, but he did things like he made doors of temples open automatically, or seemed to, using weights or using pneumatics and using steam.
Why did he do that? You don't mind me asking why?
Well, because it was cool, and they also, and probably because someone paid him. Mm-hmm. Very, very impressive way to attract people to your temple.
Oh, the gods open the door automatically.
Exactly. Talking statues was another big thing. They were really keen on those, and moving statues as well, automata. So they had these sort of clockwork and pneumatic structures inside statues that had them sort of raise their hand and seem to talk. It was actually a priest out the back talking through a funnel. So he did a bit of that, right? But the one thing a lot of people raise with me and say, well, they did, they were on the brink of becoming a proper sort of scientifically based technological industrial revolution style of culture. They say he invented a steam engine. What he actually invented was a little toy, which was basically a sphere of metal that had some spouts sticking out of it. You filled it with water and suspended it over a flame. And as the steam came out of these little nozzles, it would spin around. That was great as something to entertain your guests at a dinner party. You put it in the middle of the table, and everyone would clap and say, "That's very, very clever here and well done." What you couldn't do with that was actually make it do any actual mechanical work. You couldn't scale it up, say, to have it maybe drive a train or something along those lines. The Greeks and Romans didn't have. They kind of understood the principle of steam moving stuff, but they didn't understand why. They certainly didn't have the mathematics, the metallurgy, or the machine, like precision tooling, to be able to make a steam engine. So the idea that meant that the ancient Greeks were on the brink of coming up with steam engines is total nonsense. The other problem is people have got this idea that all you need for technological advancement is for someone to come up with the idea. And then it magically just kind of happens. It spreads throughout the society. I call this the civilization tech tree vision of history. It's like computer games where you're building a world, and if you unlock this particular technology that allows you to unlock the next 2 and unlock the next 4 and so on. History didn't actually work like that. What tends to happen is that various elements come together in exactly the right way, usually when there's a economic imperative. So steam engines were invented, they had the technology, they had the concept, but it wasn't invented until there was an actual economic need to be pumping a lot of water out of coal mines in 18th century England. That's when they invented steam engines, because they had an economic driver to do it. And then they discovered, well, these things actually work really well. Now we've perfected them. We'll now use them to do other things like hauling coal and driving ships and so on. So the idea that you just come up with the idea of steam making stuff move and therefore you're on the brink of an industrial revolution, that's just not how technology works. So the idea that they were doing a whole lot of science in the modern sense at the Great Library in the Mouseion is largely wrong. They were doing sciencey natural philosophy stuff. Not much of it was, as well as a whole lot of poetry study, not much of it was actually being applied, if any at all, to anything technological. So the idea of the Great Library of Alexandria is this sort of, hotbed of, or great furnace of innovation, because that's just what happens, and where you gather enough books is largely nonsense. And so the idea that we were on the brink of an industrial revolution before the Christians came along and destroyed the Great Library is fantasy.
There's no evidence for that, right?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and we can play games in our head all day, but it's not,
Hypotheticals are fun, but they've got to be grounded in reality. So one of the reasons why there wasn't as much technological, it wasn't as much of a driver for technological innovation of mechanizing kind, is that they had a labor surplus. They had literally millions of slaves. That's what their whole economy was based on. And to take some of the work away from those slaves and give it to machines, there was just no reason to. And there's even a story about the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who had a guy come to him with some kind of mechanical way of hauling stone columns for building temples. And this guy showed it to the emperor and said, "Would you sponsor this?" And the emperor was very impressed. We don't know what the machine was, but there was some kind of mechanical way of doing it. The emperor was very impressed, gave the guy some money as a reward, but wouldn't encourage him to actually to use the invention, because he said, if the workers don't have any work, what will we do? The Roman Empire had a problem of not just lots of slaves, but also lots of unemployed or underemployed people. It had a big population, and Rome in particular had a massive proportion of its population that basically did fuck all day and lived off the grain dole that was provided by the emperors. And if they didn't get their grain, they rioted, and this is something that happened pretty regularly. So you wanted to keep them as busy as possible, and you sure as hell didn't want to be having people inventing machines that made unemployment even more.
Wow.
What we see later is that we get a pandemic hit in the 6th century, just around about the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. We also get some massive climate change thanks to some major volcanic eruptions. Population dropped dramatically, particularly in Western Europe. And so you went to the opposite problem, that went from a labor surplus to a labor shortage. And what you see then is in the early medieval period is people really starting to harness and develop technology to really sort of harness machines. So we get lots and lots of water mills. The Romans had them, but we get far more of them all across medieval Europe, and we get them being used for a wider range of things. We get the invention of windmills. We get the invention of tidal mills. So there's a series of a number of very good books on what's effectively a kind of a mini industrial revolution in medieval Europe, which is not what you think of when you think of medieval Europe. You think of medieval Europe as this backward place and the Romans as advanced. It was kind of the other way around, which is kind of interesting. But it's all about economics. It's not about people just coming up with ideas.
Wow. I mean, I never knew that. That's quite interesting to think about. I mean, don't get me wrong. The older empire probably had far more people.
It did. And that's why they didn't need to harness mechanical power in the same way. Whereas a small village had a big incentive to build a mill that actually freed them up to do other things, and it kind of escalated from there. And a lot of other things that came out of that mechanization then led to the real industrial revolution. Things like the creation of mechanical clocks, for example, which revolutionized the mechanization of things generally. Bit of a tangent.
That was fun though. That was a fun tangent. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about the history of technology. Yeah.
You hear me?
So
the Christians burned the library, right?
Yes. Let's get to that bit. So what happened to the Great Library of Alexandria? Well, the story is the Christians burned it. Short version, they didn't. Right. So anyone who talks about the Great Library of Alexandria being burned by Christians is perpetuating a myth. That's not what happened. What actually happened was a series of events that led to the slow degradation and eventual end of the Mouseion and its library associated library collections. So remember, the Mouseion was established by the Ptolemaic Kings, and the Ptolemaic Kings, it was their little plaything. So the last king of Ptolemaic Egypt last ruler was Cleopatra. That Cleopatra. And she was in a civil war with her younger brother over the throne. He was a 14-year-old kid, and she was in this basically in conflict with him. That got caught up in a civil war that was happening in the Roman world, where Julius Caesar was mopping up the end of a civil war with his main rival, Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great was defeated in a battle in Greece. He fled to Egypt, and Cleopatra's little brother Ptolemy thought a good way to curry favour with Caesar would be to cut Pompey's head off. So he then presented Julius Caesar with the severed head of Pompey the Great. This actually didn't go down very well with Caesar, who actually was quite an old friend of Pompey's, even though they were rivals, and who didn't like the idea of some teenage barbarian cutting off a noble Roman senator's head. So so Pompey basically angered the wrong guy. Cleopatra knew that the best way to Caesar's heart was through his penis, and proceeded to then have an affair with Caesar, which was quite a passionate affair. Caesar then intervened in the civil war on her side, and as a result, she won.
Women have that, that thing, man.
She was good at it because she had an affair with Caesar, and then after Caesar was assassinated, she had an affair with his almost successor, Mark Antony. But she picked the wrong side there. She and he ended up coming to a sticky end. But what happened then was in the course of that war, on behalf of Cleopatra, was Caesar laid siege to Alexandria. And at one point, his troops were storming the docks in the upper city, so down on the waterfront. They came under fire by archers and possibly some artillery. And so his soldiers set fire to the buildings that these archers were firing from, which were these storehouses down on the docks. And unfortunately, those storehouses seem to have held a large part of the collection of the Great Library of Alexandria, which then went up in smoke. Now,
can I say one thing that I just feel like I got to say about that, though? I do wish that didn't burn down, because part of me, we do have trouble. Like you said, we have various sources. For me right now, Manetho and Berosus, and like trying to figure out some of the early Jewish literature and how we have these strange like mythology tales about Moses that come from Berosus or Manetho and things. Like we had more of that stuff. I'm not talking about the advancement of science and stuff like people want to create the myth about. I'm talking like
history.
Yeah.
What I'd say to you is, welcome to the study of ancient history. The number of times, like you're constantly reading and thinking, well, if we had more source material, then this would be so much easier. Mm-hmm. Or I wish we had this work. It's particularly bad when you know a work once existed and now it doesn't. So I mentioned that 30-volume history that Livy wrote. One of my areas of specialization is the study of the early Germanic tribes, the ones that later invaded the Roman Empire. We have very, very few sources about their early history. We got very few sources about them at all. There was a 30-book or 30-scroll history of the Roman Germanic wars by Livy, gone. We just don't have it, and this happens all the time. You're constantly coming across these references to these sources, which if we had them, it'd be fantastic.
Well, I don't know if you know that show Barbarian or whatever it came out. There's like I know it's probably not. It's Hollywood, but she's hot, the blonde with the freaking stripe, or whatever. What I'm talking about.
That's the story of Arminius and Quintilius Varus. That's a great story. That TV series is pretty. It's a bit Game of Thrones, but it's a terrific story. So that's basically what seems to have happened. Now, the only thing here is that we don't get any clear references to Caesar doing this until about a century later, and that seems to be because Caesar and his successors were very sensitive about this, and so none of the sources about the Alexandrian War refer to this directly. It's not until the Julio-Claudian dynasty, so him and his family and its successors, ended with the assassination of Nero, and the next dynasty got into control, which was the Flavian dynasty, that people started to actually speak openly about this. But even though there's some people who are a little skeptical about whether it ever happened, it does seem to have. There's a lot of multiple references to it, and a hell of a lot of writers, as a result, when they refer to the library after that point, they use the past tense. So it seems like, for many people, that was effectively the end. But we do know that the Mouseion continued after that, because the Mouseion wasn't burnt down, it was the collection. So we do know the Mouseion continued. We know that when Mark Antony briefly became ruler of Egypt, when he started having his affair with Cleopatra, there's one story about how he allegedly annexed the collection of the Great Library of Pergamon, the rival to the Great Library of Alexandria, and took it back to Alexandria to replace the books that Caesar's fire had burned. That's probably not true, but it certainly does indicate that there was a loss and that they were trying to recoup that loss. What we do know is that after Egypt, effectively, with the death of Cleopatra, became annexed by the Roman Empire, the Mouseion was now sponsored by the Roman emperors. The only problem was the Roman emperors were way off in Rome on the other side of the Mediterranean, not sitting in the building next door in the temple complex, in the palace complex in Alexandria. So they weren't probably as invested in keeping the Great Library and the Mouseion funded. So it does seem to have struggled. So we're getting indications in the references that we have that where formerly the directors of the Great Library or the directors of the Mouseion had been great scholars, now they tended to be kind of political flunkies. In one case, the commander of the Royal Palace Guard. It seems to have been a kind of a signature, something that was kind of given, okay, you're now that. Whereas before it had been a very high status, scholarly position. Now it doesn't seem to have been quite as much.
Yeah. I was going to say some of the famous philosophers and stuff that we talked about
earlier, but not later. There are exceptions to that. So the Emperor Claudius, who was the fourth emperor of Rome, was a scholar himself. He was an author and a historian and a grammarian. And he really did sponsor the Great Library. He built a new wing to the Mouseion, which was dedicated to him. And he stocked it with his books. You can do this shit when you're an emperor, right?
Yeah,
he stocked it with his books. And he mandated that at least once, possibly twice a year, there would be a grand public reading of all of his works that everyone had in the library, in the Mouseion, had to attend. Again, you can do this when you're an emperor.
That's pretty cool.
Look, if I became emperor, I'd probably end up doing the same sort of shit. So yeah, why not? So there were ups and downs. On the whole, though, we know that the Mouseion continued, and therefore the Great Library, probably in diminished form, continued into the 3rd century. What happened in the 3rd century, though, was the Roman Empire almost fell apart. So where beforehand, the 1st and 2nd century, there'd been some political upheavals, but on the whole, there'd been a fairly sort of straight transition of power from one emperor to another, generally. In the 3rd century, that collapsed. The army realized that they were the kingmakers, and the army also realized that when you made a new emperor, you got a big cash bonus. So there was a big incentive to make new emperors pretty regularly. Oh. And so what happened in the 3rd century was the middle of the 3rd century, in about over the course of about 50 years, there were about as many emperors. There were about 50 emperors in 50 years. Some of them lasted a couple of years. Some of them lasted a few months. A couple lasted no more than a week. At some point, there were 2 or 3 emperors at any given time. Towards the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire basically split into 3 parts. There was the bit that had Rome. There was another bit that was called the Empire of Gaul, which was Gaul, parts of Spain and Britain. And then there was an eastern bit called the Kingdom of Palmyra, which was ruled by a non-Roman queen called Zenobia. And so the empire was and barbarians were invading. The whole thing was really going to shit. So the empire was in grave danger of collapsing in the 3rd century. The Roman Emperor Aurelian pulled it back together. So he fought a series of wars that reunited the empire. He went and fought the Kingdom of Palmyra, defeated Zenobia. In the course of that, he laid siege to Alexandria. And as part of that siege, he burnt the entire royal quarter of the lower city. And that included the Mouseion and therefore the library. We don't get any references to the library in any kind of present tense form or to the Mouseion after that. There's one exception, which I won't go into, but on the whole, I think everyone pretty much agrees that was the end. If there hadn't been the end, then not very long after that, there was a major earthquake which destroyed large parts of Alexandria, and then the earthquake triggered a tsunami which swamped the lower city and deposited ships on buildings that were 6 stories high. So it was a huge tidal wave which completely inundated the lower part of the city. So if the Great Library had somehow survived the fire of Aurelian and an earlier fire by Caracalla, then it would have been destroyed in either the earthquake or the subsequent tidal wave. That's it. That's the end.
So
no Christians. No Christians.
Didn't burn the library.
Yeah. So where does the story come from?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Well, when people talk about, I sometimes get people, when I talk about this stuff, I say on Twitter, and they say, check your facts, Christians burned down the Great Library. And I say, okay, where can I find that in the sources? Silence, because it doesn't exist. There is no source that talks about Christians burning down the Great Library of Alexandria. So where does it come from? It comes from Edward Gibbon, who was an 18th century English historian who wrote a very famous monumental book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which has actually shaped a lot of attitudes ever since about history, Roman history in particular, and the end of the empire in general. The thing about Gibbon was that he was very anti-Christian. So he was heavily influenced by deist philosophers in France, such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau. And he was very anti-Christian. He'd gone through a bit of a Christian phase at university. He became a Catholic, actually, much to his Protestant family's dismay. He then went the other way. He wasn't an atheist; he was a deist, but he saw Christianity as a major force for evil in the world. So he never hesitated about getting a little jab against Christianity in his book. In fact, in The Decline and Fall, one of the main reasons he said that the Roman Empire fell was it was sapped of its manly vigor and strength by Christian philosophy. No modern historian takes that very seriously, but that was part of his thesis.
Yeah.
So Gibbon
was a pushover. You know what I mean? Because I'm just.
Exactly. There's all kinds of problems with that idea, but there's certainly a lot of stories that he tells in Decline and Fall where he's really getting a kick in against Christianity. He was writing in a period before the discipline of history that we have today as being a discipline of based on objective, as much as we can, objective analysis of trying to leave value judgments and trying to leave political bias and so on out of it. That hadn't even developed. So he was writing in a period of antiquarian history where basically the main reason you wrote history was to make political points and was to make points about morality and so on. So one of the points he was making was Christianity is bad. So he tells the story of the destruction of the Serapeum, or the Serapeum. Remember I mentioned how there were overflow libraries in other parts of the city. So the Great Library in the Mouseion itself was down in the Royal Quarter next to the palace. That was in the lower city down near the docks. The upper city was on higher ground, including a hill that had a major temple to the god Serapis. Serapis was kind of a hybrid of Zeus or Jupiter, the Greco-Roman god, and an Egyptian, and a form of the Egyptian god Horus. So Serapis was a major Egyptian cult. This temple was one of the biggest and apparently most beautiful temples in the ancient world, and it was a major feature in the ancient city. And it had a daughter library, so it had a smaller library that was part of the overflow from the original Mouseion collection. So when the Mouseion was destroyed, the temple of Serapis still had its library well into the 5th century. Sorry, 4th century. What happened in the beginning of the 4th century, though, is that the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian and brought to an end the persecution of Christianity that had been in place for the previous few decades. And he passed a kind of an edict saying that everyone could worship whatever way they liked, which kind of lifted a lot of restrictions on Christianity. partly as a result of that, partly as a result of Constantine sponsoring Christianity, partly for demographic reasons, Christianity then really began to become a major religion. It had been quite a small sect before. By the end of the 4th century, it was well on the way to becoming the dominant religion in the empire. And in the eastern part of the empire, the majority of people were Christians. There were still many pagans, but certainly in cities, and particularly in Alexandria, it was very much a Christian city by the 4th century. The Christians tended to be among the lower classes. The upper class tended to be more conservative, and they clung on to paganism for a hell of a lot longer. So there was quite a bit of conflict in Alexandria over religion. Alexandria had always been a hotbed. It was renowned for being a hotbed of street politics, brawling, riots, people being assassinated in the streets, all this sort of stuff. So this was nothing new. But what happened at one point was the patriarch, so the bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, was in the process of renovating some temples that had been abandoned and fallen derelict. And he was renovating them to turn them into churches. And apparently, while they were doing this with one of these temples, they found some cult objects from the former pagan days of the temple, including an enormous penis. So they got this gigantic phallus, which they then started parading through the street in mockery. And all the Christians were laughing at this huge, cock that they were carrying down the street, saying, "Look at this pagan penis! Isn't this funny?" Ancient history is often quite amusing. So anyway, look, penises are always funny. So here they were mocking this huge cock. The pagans weren't very happy about this, and a group of fairly militant pagan philosophers who were part of the Neoplatonic school of Iamblichus were very unhappy, and they decided to get revenge. So they holed up in the temple of Serapis, which was possibly itself derelict at this stage, and used to venture out at night, kidnap Christians, drag them into the temple, torture them, crucify them, and kill them, or just throw them down, torture them and throw them down wells. Yeah, the ancient world was also very violent. So, not surprisingly, the Christians weren't very happy about this, and the prefect of the city, the ruler of the city, called out the troops, and there was a siege. The pagans held up in the temple, held off the army, and there was a standoff. Both sides then sent petitions to the emperor in Constantinople. So the siege must have gone on for quite a while, because that would have taken weeks. And then the emperor sent back an answer with a kind of a compromise. He said that the pagan gang could go free, so they weren't going to be punished, which didn't go down very well with the majority of the crowd who were Christians, but also that the temple had to be torn down so that it wouldn't be a center of pagan resistance again. So this was the compromise ruling. So the philosophers who'd been crucifying and torturing people, they got away. And then the troops started to carry out the emperor's orders and started to tear down the temple. The crowd weren't very happy at the philosophers getting away, and so they joined in. So it wasn't just troops, it was also like this mob that tore down the temple. Yeah, that was what the emperor ruled, and the people of Alexandria, who were mainly, as I said, mainly Christian, weren't very happy. And so the emperor said, well, you guys can go free, but we're going to tear down the temple so that it won't be a center of any kind of future pagan activity against the population. So the troops then started to tear the temple down. The crowd, who weren't very happy about the emperor's ruling, decided to join in. So it became this sort of like this kind of orgy of destruction. And it was considered a great tragedy because the temple was considered a very beautiful building, even by Christian standards, even by Christians. What's missing from this story is a library. So we actually have 5 accounts of the destruction of the temple, and none of them mention a library being destroyed in the process. 2 of them are ones that we would expect to actually mention that. I mean, 3 of them are Christian accounts, so maybe they might sort of think, oh, well, that's a bit embarrassing. But 2 of them are hostile accounts. One by Socrates Scholasticus, who was a Christian but was actually hostile to the bishop. He was from another faction, from another sect of Christianity. He doesn't mention the library being destroyed, and he was a scholar, so he probably would. He was also a pretty good historian, so I think he probably would have mentioned it. He doesn't. Another was Eunapius of Sardis, who was a pagan scholar, and he was furious about the temple being destroyed, and spends most of his account talking about what idiots these Christians were, how they were barbarians. He calls them beasts in the form of men. He really was not happy. And he was a scholar. He was a philosopher. So you'd think if anyone was going to mention, and by the way, they also happened to destroy one of the last repositories of the Great Library of Alexandria, you think he would, but he doesn't. So what's going on? Because we know that the Serapeum had held a large collection of books, and that it was regarded as a daughter library of the collection in the Mouseion, which now no longer existed. What seems to have happened is temples generally declined in their upkeep over this period. Remember, I was saying that Theophilus, the bishop, was renovating some temples that had been abandoned. We don't know if the Serapeum had been abandoned, but it probably wasn't getting the kind of funding that it used to get. And temples and libraries are expensive. Anyone who runs one today will tell you. Excuse me. So what probably happened was the library declined over time, over the course of the 4th century. And like a lot of libraries that can no longer be funded, rather than being destroyed, it probably got broken up and sold. Books were precious, books were expensive, and you had a library that is short on funds. What would be the first thing you'd probably sell? You'd probably sell the books. So that's probably what happened. We do have a reference to the Serapeum about 20 years before it was destroyed by the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He seems to have visited Alexandria. He was a soldier, an officer, and he seems to have visited Alexandria at one point while he was campaigning in the eastern half of the empire. And he gives several references to things in Egypt as things that he saw with his own eyes. So he talks about the temple in the present tense, but when he references the libraries that it had held, he uses the past tense. So it seems that by the time he got there, the temple was still there, but the libraries weren't.
20 years prior to
to the destruction. Okay. So this is where the story comes from. What happens is Gibbon takes that story of the destruction of the Serapeum, ignores the fact that none of the sources actually make any mention of the destruction of the library, and says that the library was destroyed at that point, and talks about people lamenting the destruction, which is not true. There's no source that talks about the destruction of the library by that Christian mob. And then the modern version of that story, which has been perpetuated by people like Sagan, kind of conflates the burning element from the Julius Caesar story with the destruction element from the Serapeum story, puts them together, and so we get Christians burning down the Great Library of Alexandria. Didn't happen.
So what we have is technically this pagan temple is getting conflated in a period where we have evidence that it's 20 years prior when this guy says in a past tense that there was we don't even know how far behind from the past tense and when this pagan soldier is claiming it was. So we don't really know.
There are some references to the Serapeum having a library in the early 4th century. So at some point in the 4th century, it seems to have declined to the point where Ammianus Marcellinus uses the past tense about the library, but the present tense about the temple. And then the temple becomes past tense after it gets torn down. But the other interesting thing is that even when people actually tell the story of the destruction of the Serapeum, they almost always, the ones who try and use it as a stick to beat Christianity, never talk about the pagan terrorist gang that were crucifying and torturing people, which is the whole reason the thing got torn down in the first place. It's just, a mob of Christians turned up and destroyed the temple. That's kind of telling half the story. So the problem with using history to tell moral fairy tales is that it's always about cherry picking bits and putting them together and combining them, which is pretty much what Gibbon did. And then it's usually about then just repeating that stuff without bothering to check, which is what Sagan did. So Sagan tells the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, which we could probably do another whole episode on. She apparently was killed by Christians because they hated the fact that she was a wise woman who was a philosopher and astronomer and scientist. Again, myth. She was killed by a mob, and the mob were made up of Christians, but that wasn't why they killed her. It was a political thing. But in Sagan's story, she was the last librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria. And then she was killed, and then afterwards no one was there to protect the library from this mob of Christian fanatics. Total nonsense. She was killed decades after the end of the Serapeum, and the Great Library of Alexandria hadn't existed for a century by the time she was killed. So it's bits and pieces of the story of real history being put together to come up with this kind of fantasy version.
If I may, I want to obviously, let people know you really, really should check out his website for sure. Here it is, historyforatheist.com. Okay, you guys can go in here. Obviously, you can see how he does his hair. If you want to take some notes, he can teach you a few things on combing and gel. No, I'm just kidding. So some of the great myths right here, and then there's Jesus mythicism. So if you're interested in hearing what he has to say against it, obviously you're going to want to check this out for sure. But
the great myths section, there is you are. There's the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria is Great Myths 5, and the Hypatia of Alexandria is Great Myths 9. So that's those. Two are the ones I touched on. There's also that one on the loss of ancient learning, which we touched on today as well. There's a much longer article on some of the myths associated with that. It's not as simple as Christians decided to burn all the books. That's again is another caricature of history.
I need to let everybody know right here. This is a tease. You know what this means right here? This is more episodes to do with Tim. And I'm not joking. I'm dead serious. So if you're interested, come read this material. Obviously, we can always go back to Jesus mythicism. That's always something we can always, if we really want to piss some people off, that's a really fun one. But here you go into this stuff. And so I guess I wanted to give a plug, obviously, historyforatheist.com to come check him out. You guys come, leave comments, read the literature, or read the pages and tell me what you think. And also, I want to ask you this, Tim, before we go, and we've had a wonderful show. Are you still getting people who are dying on this hill about this history today that are major proponents of atheism?
Yeah. Almost every day on Twitter I come across this stuff. But the major proponents of atheism are coming out with this stuff all the time. So I take a series of claims made by A.C. Grayling just last year on the Christian destruction of ancient learning, and I use that as the basis for my article on that issue, because it's one thing to simply say, well, this is what happened, but I think what I'm trying to do with my blog is say, well, if you're making claims like this, you need to check them. Mm-hmm. And when you've got someone like A.C. Grayling, who is a distinguished academic, who has just finished writing a book on the history of philosophy for a major imprint, is coming out with stuff that as I go into in my article, which is just wrong, completely wrong, then we have a serious problem. So this is not just some random commenters on YouTube saying stuff that's wrong. I mean, if you chase every silly comment on the internet, then you're gonna die an unhappy man. I'm largely focused on people like Grayling, people like Dawkins. I've got a recent article on some stuff that Dawkins has said in his most recent book. Absolute nonsense. My problem is what is happening still way too often with people like these guys is that they are working from a caricature of history that they've just internalized. They've never checked. They just repeat it. And unfortunately, a lot of atheists quite innocently think, well, if Dawkins is saying it, if Grayling's saying it, if Sam Harris is saying it, if Christopher Hitchens said it, it must be true. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, none of those guys are historians. But actual historians have looked at what these guys are claiming and just saying, this is bullshit. And I as an atheist, I don't think we should be perpetuating bullshit. And as I've actually said before, it's not like there's a shortage of stuff that we can accuse Christianity of. They did plenty of, the Christians did and still do plenty of stuff that we can actually give them a good hard kick in the ass for.
Right.
So why make stuff up? You know, when you got things like child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, or the destruction of Native American and other native cultures, that all happened. You never hear me saying that didn't happen, because it did. I only pick up the stuff that didn't happen. You know,
I like what you're saying here, because for me, I told this to this group of people that I've engaged called Israel Only. They think that all the Gentiles are actual Israelites in Paul, right? Yeah. And I'm like, man, you're telling me everyone's wrong but you guys, other than the Black Hebrew Israelites, the British Israelitism, and Christian identity. So I'm like, yeah, where are you coming up with this? Well, they got it from these groups, and they added preterism. Well, I just say that to say, you know, I told these guys, and some of them are really kind. They really think they're onto something. And I said, look, man, you know, if you're going to argue with Christians, I just don't want the Christians to see through what you're saying, because they could easily fact check some of this stuff, and they're not going to buy. You know, when you approach these Christians with that as your argument, what are you doing trying to believe in this book? The Gentiles were Israelites. Are you an Israelite? And they're looking at you going, dude, you're telling me the guys in Acts 17, where he said in Athens, Paul's preaching to secret uncircumcised Epicurean Israelite, you know, like it becomes so absurd that Christians can't see. They can prove what you're saying is ignorant, and then therefore they're not actually going to listen to what you're saying and follow what you're suggesting. Maybe they shouldn't, those guys, but you know,
exactly. It's highly counterproductive. And this, I had an encounter with a guy on Reddit, I think it was last month, who kept saying, I keep coming across links to your blog on Christian apologist sites and discussions. You know, you're helping the Christians. And my answer to that is, I can't help who links to my blog. But if you don't want Christians to say, ha ha, look at atheists getting history wrong, the answer is not for me not to write debunking of atheist bad history. The answer is for atheists to stop getting history wrong. Just because Christians are wrong about Jesus rising from the dead and flying off into the sky doesn't mean they're wrong about everything.
And it doesn't mean you have to be, your idea about this historical event is going to affect or impact the reality of there being a God or not being a God, or this being true.
Exactly. We owe it as people who at least try and certainly claim to be rationalists. We have to be rational about this stuff. If the Christians didn't burn down the Great Library of Alexandria, then that doesn't change anything about whether Christianity is right or wrong. But we look stupid if we insist somehow that did happen.
Either we look stupid or we look like we have a bad motive, and our motives become
or both. Or both. So I just realized that there is another, and I'll very quickly, there is another myth about the end of the Great Library of Alexandria, which I often see, and that's that it wasn't burned down by Christians, it was burned by Muslims. So in this version, what actually happened is it survived right into the 7th century when Egypt got conquered by the Arabs as part of the Muslim expansion, and the Mullah Omar, who was Omar, who was the ruler, ordered that the Quran was the only book that was needed, and so he ordered for all the books of the Great Library to be burned to heat his bath water. So it was to heat his bath, and that was the end, right? Again, it's a great story, you know, bloody Muslims, and we know that they're anti-intellectual, and here he is like burning these wonderful books so that he can have a steam bath. This is all based on one account, which was written 250, 300 years later by a Christian who was anti-Muslim, and there's no other references to it at all. So it seems to be a bit of an anti-Muslim folk tale that Christians were telling centuries later. There's no historian actually accepts it as being accurate. So that's another one that you might come across occasionally. Now, again, Muslims have done plenty of bad things, particularly recently. We've got plenty of examples of Muslims behaving badly. But so why make up a story like that, or accept a story like that, which is obviously not true? But again, I have people, insisting that that's accurate, and I've come across Dawkins repeating that one as well. We need to get our facts. It's very simple, folks. We need to get our facts straight. So thanks for your endorsement of the site, mate. I do appreciate your support. And, you've got a good audience. Some of them don't like me because of my anti-Jesus mythicism conversations that I've had with you, but I don't care.
It comes down to, once again, the same thing. Like, if there was a guy, if there wasn't a guy or there was a guy, it's not going to change the outcome that religion's false, right? So
that's right.
That you don't believe it. You and them have that in agreement. So I have and I feel like it's the same thing as what we're kind of describing here. It's like, dude, I love both. I love to entertain all these ideas. At the same time, I like to think, for me, and I've said this on air, I like to think, and someone asked me in a live show, do you think that Jesus existed? I said, to me, it seems most likely there was a guy at the basis and in the development here. Yeah. I don't think there's anything ridiculous about making that statement. I think it would be ridiculous to say that I'm saying that is ridiculous. I think that would be, to say, well, I'm sorry, I disagree. I think it's more likely this. Okay. But to say that it's ridiculous, to say that there was probably a guy who had probably a brother named probably James isn't ridiculous. So I don't know.
It's not that hard to conceive. And sometimes I have people sort of saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and you don't have extraordinary evidence. So I go, that's fine. I'm not making an extraordinary claim.
Right.
There was a Jewish preacher who preached some stuff and people then came to believe that he was the Messiah, and then over a long period he got turned into a god. That's not an extraordinary claim. That shit happens all the time. There's a guy in Russia right now called Vissarion who is claiming he's the Messiah.
I'm trying to interview that guy. I am. I just interviewed the one from Australia last night.
Awesome. Which one from Australia? We got a Messiah too, do we?
The Jesus AJ from Australia. If you know.
No.
Let me share the screen because I think it's important to show you guys who the real Jesus is. If you're really wondering,
well, if he's Australian, we could go and have a coffee.
The Australian, he's actually a really nice guy. You'd be shocked.
I'm sure he is. Yeah, a lot of lunatics are.
Oh, I know. So let me show you here. This is Jesus, right here, him and his wife.
Wow. What's his name?
He goes by AJ.
AJ.
Yeah, that's his nickname, of course, but he says he's Jesus. And of course, I interviewed him last night. I had a very nice conversation with him. I said, look, I'm going to poke a little bit, AJ, or I didn't call him AJ. I called him Jesus for the sake of it. And I said, look, I'm going to poke a little bit. How can I know? What's the best evidence you can give me that you're Jesus? I know you can't perform miracles in this go around. There's certain things that he goes up front and says, look, those are myths that were made about me. I've been alive for 2,000 years and stuff. But long story short, I said, what is the best evidence? And he's like, well, a lot of these people who claim to be me, he had to build this up, they have spirits that are like cloaking them, and they feel those spirits are telling them that they're Jesus, which is what's coaching them to thinking they are. He goes, I don't have a spirit cloaking me. And I said, well, how do I know you're not, being tricked by a spirit too? Dude, it was so funny because in the middle of the interview, I got to say it was, for me being a skeptic, I think the guy's a great guy. I really do. I talked to him. He's a nice guy, but in the middle of this, we asked about where some of these individuals from history are at. Where's Muhammad? Where is he at in the ranks of hell? Because he doesn't believe hell like Christians do. He thinks that there's like journeys where you still grow and develop and try to become more spiritual in the afterlife. Anyway, we asked about Joseph Smith, and he goes, I don't know. Let me ask. And on air, he goes, he's in the third rank of, and I said, hold on. Did you just ask? Yes.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've just found what you've been talking. I've just pulled up his wiki page. I've got to look. Oh, okay, he's from Queensland. That explains a lot. Queensland is the Australian equivalent of Florida.
Okay,
but it's also Bible Belt, so it's kind of like Florida crossed with, I don't know, Alabama or something. But his partner Mary Suzanne. She's Mary Magdalene.
Yes. Yeah. It gets deep. There's 14 people who've returned.
Right.
Who've come and I saw one of the documentaries, one of the guys who's panicking, the guy asks him, and I've never seen like anyone be this freaking crazy looking. Who is he to you? And he starts to go, if you knew, like he just, dude, I can't even tell you.
This is one of the things that happens when people sort of say, particularly when Christians say to me, well, if it was just a Jewish preacher, then how is it that half the planet worships him as a god? I said, because people can convince themselves of all sorts of shit. Mm-hmm. How did half the population of the United States become convinced that Donald Trump was a great bloke?
Right.
When he quite clearly is a complete asshole. I mean, people can convince themselves of all kinds of strange things. I'm so glad you put me onto AJ.
Absolutely.
He used to be in the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes, bro. He is an interesting guy. If you want to talk to him at some point, you can definitely do so. I'm actually in a video series.
I don't think so.
I don't know. You turn out bad.
I went through a stage of talking to kooks because I thought it was funny, but now I just think it's a bit cruel.
I'm not doing anything cruel.
You're not.
Yeah.
No, you're not.
But
we're not. Yeah.
I do want people who are going to observe this and see my patience, of course, because I'm going to be very patient. Last night, I had 2 hours of patience of being kind, but I want them to see, like, any Christian who's, believing, or any religion really, who's to say that this guy isn't who he says he is?
Good point.
And you're wrong. Good point. So you got to start using rational thought. You got to start using your brain, guys, and stop falling for. And the guy, when he talks, man, he sounds so Christian. He makes Christians feel like they really should consider him.
He's got some YouTube videos. I think that's the rest of my morning.
Oh, dude, that's a rabbit trail. You're gonna get into some rabbit trails.
That's cool.
Look, thank you so much, man. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to do this. I say this because, I'd like to see you guys give me your thoughts on him after reading some of his material. If you have some criticism, bring it.
Yeah. And look, thanks for saying that, because quite often when people would comment on my stuff, they sort of they dismiss me because of something that they think they know. And I say I cover that in my article in some depth, and that's wrong. So if you're going to try and dispute what I'm saying, fine, and I'm more than happy to actually be corrected if I have actually got any details wrong. But I'm not making, this is not my theory,
right?
I'm presenting what historians agree. So and my article is pretty long. Most of my articles are about 7,000 to 10,000 words long. So make yourself a cup of coffee and get comfortable. But please read the article before commenting. I think that would be the best idea.
And this is that famous video that everybody knows.
I've embedded the Sagan video.
So thank you so much, and let's do this again, brother.
Absolutely, man. More than happy to talk to you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, do not forget, we are MythVision.